Hi Booktube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I've got a bit of a reading update for you. I've finished a couple of books, 3 books since the beginning of September. 2 of them are quite short, and then the last was pretty big and was the last part of a series. So what I'll do is I'll talk about those 2 short books, and then once I've talked about them, I'll talk about the series I finished as a whole and see what I think of it. One of the events in September is Shakespeare. It's all about the works of William Shakespeare, and one of the plays that they were looking at this year was Twelfth Night, which recently I was wondering how many of his comedies have I actually read. I was kind of under the impression I'd read quite a lot of them or all of them. But then when I sat and thought about it, I was like, have I actually read Twelfth Night? I'm not sure. There were a couple of others where I was in a similar position. I think I had read this before, and I think part of the reason I was confused is there were just little elements in the play, like the exchanging of rings and things like that, that crop up again and again in Shakespeare's comedies. I think there's an element of that in The Merchant of Venice, if I remember correctly, and certainly in the Gentlemen of Verona, Two Gentlemen of Verona. There's, I think, a whole thing. It's a bit more important, the exchanging of the rings in that play. So that's where I was a little bit confused. I'll just turn this off so you've got a bit of a nicer picture there. You've got Shakespeare's face. But I enjoyed the play as a whole. It was one of those plays where it was kind of over just as I was getting into it, in a way. It resolved much faster than I was expecting it to. It's a story of really our main character is Viola, who's been shipwrecked, and she believes that her brother, who was on the ship with her, has perished in the wreck, and she's washed up on the shore of a dukedom of this country called Illyria, and essentially she's here now, so she wants to get into the court somehow, and so she decides to disguise herself as a man and sort of pass as a eunuch, basically. So she's dressed up as a man, calling herself Cesario, and is in the court. Now this Duke Orsino, is in love. The first scene is him essentially just going on and on about how he's in love with this local noblewoman called Olivia, and once Cesario is on the scene, he wants to use Viola, Cesario, to help with his suit, to go over to her palace and to make a case for him and things like that. And so that goes on, and it just gets more and more kind of complicated. Olivia is more interested in Cesario / Viola than she is in the Duke, and it's a whole sort of comedy of errors and comedy of mistaken identity. Lots of little lines, lots of little moments in here, particularly between Viola and Olivia, and sometimes Viola and the Duke. And it's Viola talking about, I suppose, herself as a woman in a way she maybe couldn't if she wasn't passing for a man, I suppose. There's lots of little interesting things in there. I found the subplot to this actually much more entertaining than the main plot. And so a few local noblemen decide to make Olivia's steward, Malvolio, believe that Olivia has fallen in love with him, and that she wants him to do all these things, and then they manage to kind of hoodwink everyone into thinking that he's gone mad. I found that much more entertaining, and then some of those noblemen as well sort of get part, kind of involved in another subplot, which becomes more important for the main plot. But yes, on the whole, I enjoyed it. It just ended, just as I was getting into it, and just resolved a little too quickly, maybe a little too easily for my liking. And then the other short book I finished This is one that certainly qualifies for Shorty September, although I'm not sure which prompt it would fit into. I think I'm going to essentially read a load of random short books and then see if they fit into any of the prompts. So we'll work it out at the end of September. I read The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and it's just a wonderful gothic story about a woman essentially in confinement, although she's not really in confinement. She can go out riding, but it's this essentially this. It's kind of unfortunate that the story it's telling, in a way, isn't a very uncommon story. That it's kind of the whole thing where I forget the word, but it's essentially if a woman is slightly unhappy or depressed or is anxious or anything like that in the sort of mid to late 1900s, they just sort of label it as nervous problems and that she should do as little work as possible. Stay in the house. Don't try to be too ambitious because you'll only wear yourself out, and all that kind of language comes out. And really, that just exacerbates the problem, particularly if the woman in question is ambitious and she does want to do things. And that was the case with Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And it sort of led her to a nervous breakdown. And it's true for the narrator of this story. And it's essentially like a case study of somebody getting closer and closer to this breakdown and to madness. And so she's really, instead of having a nice sort of parlour downstairs that she can stay in, during the day when she's in the house, she used to stay in this room with the yellow wallpaper that she hates, and it's the bedroom. And so at night she thinks that the wallpaper starts moving, and that there are sort of two patterns. There's a pattern at the front and a pattern behind. And then as it goes on and as she sees it moving more and more, she starts hallucinating more and more about what's behind the wallpaper, and then what is behind the wallpaper sort of gets out of the wallpaper. And it could go a lot further. I suppose part of what's brilliant about it is the fact that it doesn't go further, and it just sort of brings you to the point of total breakdown, and then it ends quite suddenly in a really dramatic way. The last few pages of this story are just really tense, really brilliant. So I loved it. I just wish, I don't know, somehow there was more of it, and yet its brevity is part of sort of what makes it work so well. So it was a bit of a weird thing going on there. And then the series that I finished was Karl Ove Knausgård's My Struggle. And I was just very curious about this whole series from when I first heard about it. It's a work of essentially auto-fiction, and so it's apparently a novel, and that's how it's labelled, and yet, really it's not. It's about his own life, about real people. So there's a contradiction in terms at the very sort of base level of what this book is, what this series is. So I was very intrigued about it. And so what I thought I'd do is I'll very, very, very quickly give like an overview of the series, of what each book is about. And then I'll sort of go into some of the questions I had about it, some of the questions that are brought up in the book. I've written very just like sort of 1-2 word sort of summaries of each book. So A Death in the Family is about his father dying. I've just written Dead Father as my summary. There's a bit of his childhood, a bit of an introduction to his life around the time he's writing it, a bit of his adolescence, and then by the time we're in the heart of the book and in the second half of the book, it's about his father dying, and it's his father is living with his mother, as in the father's mother, Knausgård's grandmother, and the house is in a sorry state. The father's an alcoholic. grandmother's started drinking. There are bottles everywhere. There's mess everywhere. And when the paramedics get to the house, he's just been dead, sitting in a chair for a day or more. So it's quite a grim situation that he's walking into when he's going over to sort the house out and prepare for the funeral. So that's what the first book's about. Very frank, very honest, and you're getting a bit of everything. There's a bit of the teenage angst, a bit of the sort of innocence of early childhood, and a bit of this sort of frankness that you get with the more adult Knausgård in his writing. Then the next book is my favourite, A Man in Love. I sort of put this down as a book all about second chances, in a way. It's really quite a departure from the first book. Almost nothing that happens in the first book has much of an impact on this book. It's about him, probably a couple of years after he's heard about his father dying, or maybe not that long after, I can't remember. But he leaves Norway, where he's from, leaves his first wife, moves to Stockholm, where he only knows a couple of people, and it's about him building a new life there, starting a new relationship, eventually a new marriage, starting a new family, and writing a new novel. And so there's lots of seconds. This is the second book in the series. It's his second marriage, a second city, maybe, for him to call home. And also he's writing his second novel as he's in here. And also then it ends with him beginning the My Struggle project as well. So at the end of this book, he starts writing the first book. But I loved it, and I think it's just the frank, honest voice that you have with the adult Knausgård is here strongest in the second book. And then I'll just rattle through the next few books really quickly, because I do have things to say about them, but I might try and get back to them later. So Boyhood Island is essentially childhood nostalgia. It's him talking about his, the height of his childhood, but also his relationship with his parents, and how his relationship with his mother contrasts with his relationship with his father, and the kind of lead up to his parents' divorce. Probably the best thing about this is that the way it's written sort of allows you to feed your own childhood nostalgia into what he's describing. And so even though it's not your own childhood that you're seeing there, you can very much relate to it, no matter how different your own childhood was. So I enjoyed it, but we'll get into the what I didn't like about it, I suppose, a bit later on. And I'll take a similar tack with this one, Dancing in the Dark. This is about ambition and failure, essentially. It's him just out of high school, going up to this school up north as a temporary teacher. And he wants to go up there to make money, to start on his writing, and then he can save up enough money to travel and keep on writing. And by the time he's finished traveling, he can, he can say he's finished his first novel. And in here, he is wasting money on stuff he doesn't need. He is spending way more time drinking and thinking about girls and women than he does writing, really. And a lot of the writing he does doesn't really get him anywhere. And so there's this sort of frustration through the whole thing, and it is kind of frustrating to read. And then, in a way, on the whole, most of the next book, book 5, is more ambition and failure. It's about him, it's about him essentially on his journey to actually getting to his first marriage and him writing his first book. And so by the end of this, it feels like a companion to the second book, and it sort of lays all the context for the first 2 books. Towards the end of the book, it sort of carries on from where book 1 ended, and then fills in the gap to where book 2 begins, which I found really satisfying. But before you get to that point, you have to go through even more ambition, even more failure, even more drinking, even more him thinking that he knows what he's doing, and he really isn't. So that's the first 5 books. And then the book that I finished, just earlier this month, was The End, and it's by far the longest. It's about twice the size of most of the books in here, and it's my second favourite of all of them, I think. It's split into 3 sections. The first section is about the lead up to the first book being published, and because he's writing about real people, he's going to send the manuscript to friends and family members who are involved for them to read, and then if they have any objections, their name can possibly be changed, and maybe certain details about where they live or what they do for a living maybe can be altered slightly so that people can't sort of work out exactly who they are. And so he does that, and on the whole it's kind of fine until he gets an email from his uncle, his father's brother, who takes a massive objection to him talking about his father in this way. It's essentially he's just bringing all of the family's dirty laundry about his father's alcoholism, the state that this house was in, what happened to the grandmother who was living with Knausgård's father, and she's now passed away. And so his uncle thinks it's disgusting that he's doing this, that he's tainting the family name, that he's essentially kind of selling out. He's using, and the uncle is saying he's exaggerating the family's misfortunes for profit, essentially, is the big objection. And as it goes on, it turns out that this uncle really doesn't like Knausgård and has never liked Knausgård's mother, and so really a lot of his own resentments that he's built up over time are coming out and are sort of feeding this, and so it turns into this massive thing and this massive anxiety, and so the first part of the book is all about this anxiety and working out what they're going to do while sort of real life is going on, and it's sort of back to the kids, back to doing things in nursery and stuff like that. And then the last part is more about these bigger things, the consequences of writing these books and how it affects real life, in and amongst, again, looking after the kids. And so it's essentially the last book is a weighing up of the whole project, of trying to work out if it was worth it, and of looking into some of the consequences of that. So that's sort of generally the series as a whole. And there are kind of 2 questions, 2 issues that Knausgård, I think, is trying to bring up in here. That the first is the question of the balance between literature and life, as someone who wants to think about literature, someone who wants to read, someone who wants to write. How can you balance that with the rest of your life, particularly when you've got a wife and kids and commitments, and then when things go wrong, when so his wife has she has periods of sort of profound depression and mental illness, and that takes over everything, and then everything's okay, and is it okay to go back then after it's sort of kind of resolved to go back to writing? So it's that kind of, I don't know, walking on eggshells almost at times. So that's the first issue, how to balance literature and life. And then the other question that I found he was asking himself, or a challenge he was kind of setting himself all the way through here, was to just be a good person. And how can I be a good person? And then you kind of get the question, can I be a good person? Can I be honest? And I think the way he's writing with this frankness, he's just trying to be honest and frank, and in a way, it's kind of a way of, people say honesty is good, so he's trying to be a good person, he's trying to be honest, lay it all bare, and I don't think he's writing all of this in a uncaring, cold, callous way. I get the impression he cares a lot, he's actually holding a lot back, and that he's trying to be honest is essentially at at the heart of it, it's not a callousness, if that makes sense. And these things kind of come together then. This balance between literature and life, and this question of how to be a good person. And you kind of have these crises. The one question that then comes up is, well, are there things that just can't be said, that shouldn't be mentioned? And then the other kind of obvious question is, through all of this, has he actually done a bad thing? Is he actually, as a writer, a worse person because he's writing about this? And so those seem to be the questions that are sort of coming up, and are kind of built up through the first 5 books, and then are sort of dealt with more directly in the last book. And essentially, particularly with the stuff with his uncle, it's not just the uncle being angry at him and making him feel like he's done something terrible, and everyone else around him, very supportive and saying no, they like the book, so they think he's done a great thing. They can certainly anomalize many of the characters, and eventually they do change. The uncle's name and that whole side of the family, the names are changed. But the one thing that comes as a result of that is that the uncle is saying what happened with his father didn't happen the way that Knausgård said it did in the book. He's grossly exaggerated the details, and this really gets Knausgård doubting himself as to whether he has really told the truth, as to whether he is lying here. And certainly in books 3 through to 5, which I would say are the kind of saggy middle of the book, you get the impression that a lot is almost intentionally exaggerated, and that you couldn't possibly remember a lot of the stuff that he's bringing up in here. And in the 5th book, he says he can hardly remember. He only remembers a tiny fraction of what happened, and yet he writes a 500-page book about it. And so, how honest is he being there? But he's certainly doubting himself, particularly to do with his father's death. And in the middle section of this, it's in 3 sections, as I said. In the middle section, it's more of an essay, and it begins with him talking about this email he's got from his uncle, and I'm saying how him and his brother Ingvar are not worthy of the Knausgård name, and that he, the uncle, doesn't want Knausgård's father's name to be written, to be mentioned anywhere in the books. And eventually the publishers think, yeah, we should let him do this, just refer to your father as Dad, and then everyone's happy, more or less. And Knausgård really doesn't like this. He's able to refer to his mother as Sissel. He uses her first name. She is a real well-rounded character in the books, and he wants to be able to do that for his father. And yet, if he's not able to use his name, then suddenly there's this big black hole in the whole of the book. And so that's the sort of question, the kind of issue going on as we're going into the middle section of the last book. And then it sort of goes on and on and on. You start thinking about Paul Celan and this poem by Paul Celan, where he's not directly mentioning what he's talking about, and the language is really stripped back down to its roots. And over pages and pages of Knausgård analysing this poem, come to the conclusion it's a poem about being in the wake of the Holocaust, and what you maybe can and can't say about the Holocaust, or really more about the fact that people only a few years afterwards weren't talking about it anymore. And for Paul Celan, a Jew from Romania, that was a terrible thing. And so It's maybe an extreme example of something that kind of relates to this issue that Knausgård's talking about, and then that sort of digresses into a long sort of essay about Adolf Hitler, and this whole series is called My Struggle, in Norwegian, Min Kamp, and so again, there's he's taken a title straight from Hitler, and so he's going on and talking about Hitler's life, but also about how what we know from other sources, how that sort of contrasts with Hitler's own account in his autobiography and what Hitler's doing with language, and how Hitler's book in a way doesn't really work as a book on its own because of the person behind it, and that's the whole weight behind the whole book. And so again, you've got another question of literature and life there, and there are all these sort of spinning questions and issues that sort of come up from this Hitler essay, and I actually enjoyed it by the end, but it's quite hard going, and there are a lot of parallels between Hitler and Knausgård as well, which is a bit disarming. And there's a bit where he ends up talking about, it, in a way it shouldn't be so disarming that you can see so many similarities between Hitler and himself, because it's not who Hitler is that makes Hitler bad, it's what Hitler has done that makes him bad, which then goes back to the question of whether Knausgård believes what he's done in his book by mentioning his family is bad or not. And in a way, ultimately, because he keeps on writing and he finishes this series, ultimately he does think that it's worth it. He's going to keep going, and then and there's a bit then where he realizes that he is going to mention his father, and he hasn't mentioned his father's name all the way through the books, but there is just a really wonderfully wonderfully frank and honest bit where it's like, no, I am going to mention your father, and he calls him by name, and it's really wonderful. And he is going to keep on going, and he is going to keep on writing, and that's what happens. And then the last bit then is about the consequences of the rest of the books and how that sort of wears on his family, and about his wife's mental health, and essentially eventually that is the she has a breakdown, and then a manic episode sort of straight afterwards, and she's institutionalized, and I think maybe that's a kind of wake-up call. That's why he's like, right, I have to stop. Suddenly any writing, any commitments with his publishers, with interviews and events, totally out the window. The kids come first, and I don't know, there's just something to the end of that with his commitment to his kids and making sure that they're okay in the middle of this really trying time, that was wonderful. And again, it sort of answers this question to do with the balance between literature and life. And I think for Knausgård, as for all his ambition, for all his love of literature and of wanting to be a writer, wanting to be a great writer, when the rubber hits the road, the kids come first, and then the rest can work itself out when there's time, which I found really, really touching. And in the end, his wife's home from hospital, and I'm going to spoil it, sorry, by reading the last sentence of the book, or maybe I'll just read the last paragraph. So if you don't want to hear it, you can you can go, it's okay. But he says this: now it's the 7th of July, and the novel is finally finished. In 2 hours, Linda, his wife, will be coming here. I will hug her and tell her I've finished, and I will never do anything like this to her and our children again. So that's another question. He's talking about his children in this book. What are they going to think about being written of in this way? About him talking about their tantrums and their outbursts, and of his tantrums and outbursts about them, and about their parents and his parents' emotional lives and things like that. What are they going to think about that? Then we'll never take the train to Louisiana. I'm going to be interviewed on stage, after which it will be her turn because her own book has come out and it glitters and sparkles like a star-filled night sky. Afterwards, we will catch the train to Malmo, where we will get in the car and drive back to our house, and the whole way I will truly revel in, the fact that I am no longer a writer. Not that he's giving up writing full stop, but that, for a time, he doesn't have to be a writer. He doesn't have to be writing in the way he has been doing with these My Struggle books, which he wrote in a very short amount of time. So it's very intense. He wrote the whole thing in 3 years. So what is this? What is this book? What has he done? And I'll be honest, I still kind of don't know. On the front of a lot of these, it says the international phenomenon, which I think really just speaks to the media and how the media have got hold of this book. For me, the thing I enjoyed the most was the frankness of the voice, but particularly when it goes into these more essayistic sections. I feel like that's where Knausgård's really working his hardest and doing his best work, which is probably why book 2 and book 6 are my favourites, because it's there at its most intense in those 2 books. As to whether it's the best thing that's been ever been written, or whether he's the Proust of the 21st century, I don't think so. I do enjoy the way he writes. I know he's certainly not for everyone, but I'd say it's worth trying if this kind of things and this kind of thing and these kind of questions are things that interest you about the relationship between literature and life. Reflections on death and how death is presented in art, of how we react to trying circumstances, whether they're big cataclysmic things in history or whether they're our own sort of domestic issues and the small disasters in our own lives, which are still massive for us ourselves. So if things like that interest you, then I'd say it's worth trying. I would probably say, if you're at all interested, well, either one of 2 things. The first would be just read the first book. It's one of the shortest, and so you can work out if you like his style of writing, if you get on with his voice, and that might be a good way to work out. And then if you enjoy it, read book 2. And if by the end of book 2 that you're kind of hooked, then give it a go. Or you could just read book 2 by itself as well. I think that would work really well. And then really, I feel like on the whole, books 3, 4 and 5, although I was drawn in and was kind of enjoying them, are kind of superfluous. They give a lot of context. Some of the stuff he talks about maybe don't need to be mentioned, that they're just there because he's got himself to his place and he has to kind of write through it, but that there are times where it felt like the whole thing was on autopilot, and then when you get to the end of book 5 and certainly when you get to book 6, suddenly it feels like he's working on all cylinders again. And that's it. So I'll leave it there. Maybe a bit ambiguous, I suppose, but I think that goes with the territory. I think I was going to say something else. Yes, I was just going to mention humour, because there are some very funny passages in here as well. So even though there is a lot of darkness and a lot of boredom in here, there is also humour. So I didn't want to give the impression that the whole series was a bit of a downer. But that's what I've been reading recently. That's what I've finished. I'm still working my way through the poetry of John Ashberry. I'm halfway through this selection of his poetry, or just over halfway, approaching the 2/3 mark, I think. And I'm about halfway through the poetry of Emily Dickinson as well. And I've been going quite slowly through both of these poets. I've been going much more slowly through Dickinson because there's a lot more to get through, and there's not as much sort of variety in tone, which is fine, but it just means you just want to dip in every now and then. It's hard to binge read Emily Dickinson. And then I've also been reading Wolf Hall as well, with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics, and Randy Ray as well has joined in. So that's been great, and I've been really enjoying Wolf Hall. I'll let you know what I thought of it at the end. But that's it. That's the end of the video. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.